You cannot turn back, no matter what happens. That voice did not come from his team of elite bodyguards. It did not come from his $1,000,000 security system. It came from a 6-year-old boy, standing in the middle of the courtyard, clutching a notebook filled with messy scribbles. Those brown eyes stared directly into the ice-gray eyes of the most powerful man in New York. Unblinking, unflinching. Behind him, his twin brother was pointing toward the corner of the street. There, a white van sat motionless beneath the shade of a tree. It had been parked there for 3 days. 3 days. 24 hours multiplied by 3. 20 bodyguards, the highest paid in New York, took turns standing guard. None of them noticed. Security cameras scanned every corner of the street. Not a single alert was triggered, but this child saw it. Reed Ashford stood frozen in the courtyard. The man whose single nod could shake the entire city, whose single frown could send someone straight to hell. He stood there, silent, looking down at the boy. For 20 years in the shadows, he had never stopped for anything. But today, a 6-year-old child had just made him halt in his tracks, and what the boy said next would change everything. If you want to know the secret this child discovered, hit that like button to support us. And if you haven't subscribed yet, click subscribe now so you won't miss the next episodes. Reed frowned, his cold gray gaze sweeping over the boy standing in front of him. Behind him, the sleek black Maybach was already running, and Reg stood by the car door waiting. The New York morning was crystal clear, golden sunlight spilling through the maple trees lining the street. But the air between the powerful kingpin and the 6-year-old boy was thick as the sky before a storm. Reed spoke, as brief as always, each word falling with heavy force. "What did you say?" Miles didn't step back. The boy stood firm as if those small feet had grown roots into the stone beneath him. He raised his notebook, his tiny fingers opening to a page crowded with rough pencil drawings in colored crayon. "The white truck at the corner," Miles said, his voice not shaking at all. "There are 2 men inside. They've been parked there for 3 days. Reed glanced in the direction the boy was pointing. The east corner of the street, beneath the branches of an old oak, held the white truck in stillness, as if it were dead. The truck was there, that much was true, but it looked ordinary, too ordinary, like hundreds of other delivery vans that pass through the city every day. No company logo, no distinctive marking, just a white truck sitting in a quiet residential neighborhood. "Maybe they're waiting to make a delivery," Reed said, his tone indifferent, as though he were talking about the weather. He was used to ignoring things that didn't seem worth his attention. And the words of a 6-year-old child, in Reed Ashford's world, usually didn't belong on the list of things worth noticing. But Miles shook his head. He didn't look angry or disappointed at being brushed aside. He simply turned to the next page of the notebook and pointed to a new drawing. 2 shadowy figures sitting inside the truck, sketched in rough black pencil lines, but with a strange clarity all the same, and a red arrow pointing straight toward the gates of the estate. "Last night, I couldn't sleep," Miles explained, his voice even, as if he were reading aloud in class. "I went out onto the balcony. I saw them taking pictures of our gate. The flash went off 3 times. Reed fell silent. His eyes were no longer merely passing over the boy. He was truly looking now. The balcony outside the children's room was on the 2nd floor, facing directly toward the corner where the truck was parked. A perfect view, and Reed knew that a child awake in the middle of the night would see the things sleeping adults let pass unnoticed. Reg stepped closer, his voice low and respectful. "Sir, the meeting starts in 45 minutes. The council is waiting." Reed didn't answer Reg. His eyes remained fixed on the boy standing before him. The notebook in Miles's hands, the childish scrawls, the clear brown eyes without a trace of fear. Something wasn't right. Reed could feel it, even if he couldn't yet give it a name. "Is there anything else?" Reed asked, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. This wasn't the voice of a kingpin questioning a servant. This was the voice of a man who truly wanted to hear the answer. Miles nodded. He closed the notebook and held it to his chest, as if he were cradling a treasure. His voice was strangely calm, calmer than any 6-year-old Reed had ever known. "I heard them talking. The night was very quiet, so I heard them clearly. They said that when you leave, someone will call with bad news, and you'll come back." Reed went rigid for a split second. His jaw tightened, the tendons in his neck standing out. 20 years in the underworld had brought him more threats than he could count. From rivals, from traitors, from killers hired for millions of dollars. But never, not once, Had he heard a warning spoken by a 6-year-old child standing in the middle of his own courtyard? What did they say about the bad news? Reed asked, controlling every syllable. Miles looked straight into Reed's eyes. He didn't blink. He didn't look away. Those brown eyes were clear, but they held something far older than his years. They said they'd report that something had happened to my mother, and you'd come back because you'd be worried. A heavy silence settled over the courtyard. The Maybach's engine was still humming behind them, but Reed no longer heard it. My mother, Willa, the woman working in the kitchen, less than 50 steps away. She was the target? If you come back, Miles continued, his voice soft but each word distinct, each syllable falling like drops of icy water. They won't let you leave again. The wind moved through the air, stirring the maple leaves on either side of the road. Somewhere inside the estate, the sound of plates touching came from the kitchen. Life went on as if nothing were happening, but Reed knew everything had just changed. He looked at Miles, and for the first time something different entered those eyes. The doubt was gone. The indifference of a powerful kingpin was gone. What remained was curiosity, and a flicker of something that looked almost like respect. This child, 6 years old, standing before him with a notebook full of clumsy drawings in his hands, had just spoken aloud what his 20 most battle-hardened bodyguards had failed to notice. Reed didn't know whether he should believe him or not, but he knew one thing. He couldn't ignore this. Knox came running from behind and gave his brother's sleeve a light tug. He was a few inches shorter than Miles, with a round face that usually seemed made for smiling, with dimples in his cheeks, but at that moment his brown eyes were unusually serious. Knox's breathing was quick and uneven, as though he had just run a long distance, even though he had only come from the front steps into the middle of the courtyard. Miles, Knox said, still catching his breath. Tell him about the footsteps. Reed looked down at the second boy. Twins, but different. If Miles was quiet observation and stillness, then Knox was energy and sound. And right then, that usually cheerful little boy wasn't smiling at all. What footsteps? Reed asked, his voice lower than before. Knox swallowed, his brown eyes blinking fast. He looked at his brother as if searching for support, then turned back to Reed. Inside the house, last night, I heard someone walking in the hallway. Reed tensed further. Every muscle in his body seemed to draw tight. Ashford Manor had one of the most advanced security systems in all of New York. Motion sensors in every hallway. Infrared cameras running 24 hours a day. A protection team patrolling on strict shifts. No one could move through the house at night without being detected. No one. Which hallway? Reed asked, his voice sharp as a blade. Knox pointed toward the kitchen at the rear. Behind the kitchen, near Mom's room. Willa's room. Reed looked at Reg, his gaze full of meaning. He didn't need to say another word. Reg understood at once. The tall, bald man gave a brief nod, immediately pulled out his phone, and stepped away, his voice dropping to a murmur as he ordered the security team to review every second of footage from the rear corridor from the night before, through that morning. Miles added, his voice still strangely calm. It wasn't a guard, sir. That person wore different shoes. Reed repeated it, his eyes narrowing. Different shoes? Knox nodded hard, as if he were afraid the adults wouldn't believe him. The guards wear heavy shoes. Every step sounds loud. Thud, thud, thud. I'm used to it. Every night when they pass through the hallway, it sounds like that. But this person wore light shoes. Very light. Like he was trying not to let anyone hear him. The boy stopped, his brown eyes dropping to the ground as he tried to remember something. Then he looked up and added one sentence that made the air freeze solid. Like Dad's shoes. Silence swallowed the courtyard. The wind stopped blowing. The birds stopped singing. The whole wide space seemed to have had time itself paused. Reed looked at the two boys standing in front of him, Miles with the sketchbook held against his chest, Knox with those wide round eyes, far too serious for his age. They had no reason to lie. A 6-year-old child doesn't know how to invent a story about surveillance and conspiracy. And their eyes, clear as spring water, were far too innocent to be performing. But before Reed could ask anything more, the kitchen door at the back opened. Willa stepped out, a white apron still dusted with flour, her dark brown hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck. Her amber brown eyes swept across the courtyard, saw her sons standing in front of Reed Ashford, and worry immediately crossed her delicate face. She hurried toward them, her steps quick though she was trying to appear calm. Miles, Knox, are you bothering Mr. Ashford? Her voice was gentle but strained at the edges. Willa knew exactly who her employer was. She knew Reed Ashford wasn't a man who liked being interrupted, especially not in the morning before an important meeting. Reed lifted a hand, signaling for her to stop. No, they're helping me. Willa stared in surprise, her feet halting a few steps away. Helping? Her 6-year-old sons were helping the most powerful Mafia boss in New York. She didn't understand what was happening, but the unusual gravity in Reed's eyes kept her from asking another question. Knox ran to his mother and grabbed the hem of her apron in his small hand. Mom, I told him about the footsteps, the person walking in the hallway last night. Willa blinked, not understanding yet. What footsteps, sweetheart? Miles stepped forward and held out the sketchbook to her. I drew the person I saw last night, Mom, in the back hallway. I couldn't sleep, so I went out to the balcony, and then I saw him. Willa took the sketchbook, her hand trembling slightly, though she didn't know why. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was a mother's intuition. Maybe it was the memory of long nights when she had lain awake, listening to every sound in the old house, afraid of the drunken footsteps of the man she had once called her husband. She opened the sketchbook. Rough crayon lines, a shadowy figure standing in a dark hallway. No face, only a shape, tall, thin, and the shoes. Brown leather shoes with a distinctive scrape across the toe. Willa's face turned to stone. This wasn't ordinary fear. This was primitive terror, the kind that sinks into the marrow, the kind that belongs to someone who has just seen a ghost from the past step into the daylight. The sketchbook slipped from her hand and struck the stone with a dry, hard sound. Willa stood frozen, her lips moving without making a sound. Then she whispered, her voice trembling like the last leaf of autumn. No. Her breath came fast. It can't be. Reed watched every one of Willa's reactions. His gray eyes missed nothing. The way she trembled, the way all the color left her face in an instant, the way her eyes widened in horror at the rough drawing her son had made. She knew the person in that picture. Not just knew him, she was afraid of him. Afraid enough that her whole body was shaking like a leaf in a storm. Miles picked up the sketchbook and offered it back to his mother, but Willa didn't take it. She simply stood there, staring into nothing, as if her soul had already stepped outside her body. Knox reached for her hand in worry. Mom, what's wrong? Willa didn't answer. She couldn't. And Reed knew that what the two boys had discovered wasn't only a suspicious truck parked outside the gate. Someone had gotten inside. Someone Willa knew. Someone she feared more than death itself. Everything had just become far more complicated than Reed had imagined. Reed gave the order in a clipped voice that allowed no objection. Everyone inside. Seal the gate. No one goes in or out. Reg looked startled, the bodyguard's eyes flashing with a brief moment of confusion. But 20 years of working for Reed Ashford had taught him one thing. Never ask questions when his employer gave an order in that tone. A voice of steel. The voice of a man who had seen a threat before anyone else had even realized it was there. Reg gave a short nod and turned away quickly. The two guards standing near the gate moved at once, pulling the heavy iron gate shut. The sound of metal striking metal rang out through the quiet morning, dry and hard as a gunshot warning, ripping apart the false peace of the wealthy neighborhood. Reed didn't look back. He placed a hand on Willa's back, gentle but firm, and guided her toward the front door. Come with me. Willa didn't protest. She couldn't. Her legs moved like those of a sleepwalker, her eyes still wide with horror from the moment she had seen the drawing in her son's sketchbook. Miles held Knox's hand, and the two brothers followed their mother and Reed into the mansion. No one spoke. Their footsteps echoed across the polished marble floor as they moved deeper into the heart of the house, past the vast living room with paintings worth millions of dollars, past the long corridor lit by the soft golden glow of crystal chandeliers, down the stairs, then left, then through a steel door that required a security code and a fingerprint scan. The security control room. The room sat deep inside the mansion, with no windows and no natural light, only the pale blue glow of dozens of camera monitors lined up across the wall, each screen showing a different corner of the estate and the surrounding grounds. Willa stood trembling in the corner of the room, both arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if she were trying to keep herself from shattering. The blue light from the screens washed over her face and made the terrifying pallor of her already bloodless skin stand out even more. Miles and Knox stood beside their mother in silence, watching. The two boys didn't cry, didn't panic. They simply stood there with wide eyes, following every movement the adults made. As if they understood this wasn't the moment for noise, Reed stepped up to the control desk, where a technician was seated. His voice sliced through the silence like a sharpened blade. Footage from the hallway behind the kitchen. Last night. From 10 o'clock to morning. The technician nodded, fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. The main screen flickered and changed. The image appeared. At first, the hallway was empty. Dim yellow nightlights ran along the wall, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Nothing seemed unusual. An hour passed in fast-forward footage. Then 2. Still nothing. Then the timestamp on the screen jumped to 11:47 at night. A figure. Reed raised his hand. Stop. The image froze. The figure stood at the edge of the frame, only part of the body visible. The technician let the footage continue at normal speed. The figure moved, walking lightly through the hallway, head slightly lowered, face turned away, avoiding the camera lens as if he knew exactly where it was positioned, as if he had studied the security layout in advance. Zoom in, Reed ordered, his voice cold as ice. The image enlarged. The quality dropped a little, but it was still clear enough to make out the detail. No face. The person was too careful, always keeping his features turned away from the lens. But the shoes were visible. Brown leather shoes. An older style, a design from years ago. The toe of the shoe bore a distinctive scrape, a long mark running across from left to right. Willa covered her mouth. A broken, strangled sob filled the silent room. Tears spilled over and ran down her cheeks, falling soundlessly to the floor. Miles looked at his mother, then at the brown shoes on the screen. He said nothing, but his small hand tightened around his brother's. Knox pressed close against him, his round eyes not understanding why their mother was crying. Reed didn't look at Willa. He kept giving orders, his voice steady, without the slightest tremor. Switch to the outside camera. East corner. The last 3 days. The screen changed again. The familiar corner of the street appeared. The branches of the old oak tree, the empty sidewalk, and the white truck. Exactly where Miles had pointed. Exactly beneath the tree he had described. The technician ran the footage quickly. Day 1. The truck appeared at 7 in the morning, pulled into position, and didn't move. Day 2. The truck was still there. From time to time, a shadowy figure inside the cab lifted a phone and aimed it toward the mansion gate, taking pictures. Day 3. Today, the truck still sat there as motionless as if it had never stirred. 2 men took turns sitting inside, one tall and lean, one shorter and heavier, both wearing dark clothes and baseball caps that hid their faces. Reed stood silent in front of the screen for a long moment. 20 bodyguards, the most advanced camera system in the city, motion sensors everywhere. And no one had noticed the suspicious truck parked right outside his gate for 3 full days. No one except a 6-year-old child who couldn't sleep because of nightmares. Reed turned to Willa. She was still standing there, tears streaming down her face, her whole body shaking like a leaf in a storm. Her eyes hadn't left the screen, fixed on the image of the brown leather shoes, with that distinctive scrape across the toe. Reed's voice rang out, no longer as cold as before. Tout! Tout as a string pulled to the point of breaking. Those shoes. He walked toward Willa and stopped directly in front of her, his eyes locked onto her tear-filled brown ones. You know whose they are. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Reed had seen Willa's reaction when she looked at Miles's drawing. He had seen the way she froze, the way the tears spilled out, the way her whole body trembled when she recognized the figure in the picture. She knew. She knew exactly. And Reed needed to know. Willa didn't answer. Her lips moved, but no sound came. The tears kept falling without stop, like a small river made of pain and fear she had been holding back for the last 2 years. She didn't need to speak. The tears had already said everything. Reed stood facing Willa, less than 2 steps away. The blue glow from dozens of camera screens washed over both their faces, creating an atmosphere heavy as the air before a thunderstorm. In that windowless room, time itself seemed to stop. Only the faint hum of machinery and Willa's ragged breathing broke the silence. You're going to tell me? Reed said, his voice low and solid as granite. It wasn't a request. It wasn't an offer. It was an order. Right now. Willa trembled, her amber brown eyes fixed on the polished floor. She couldn't look at Reed. She couldn't face those eyes boring into her, reading every thought, every secret she had tried to bury for the last 2 years. Miles stepped to his mother's side, his small hand slipping into hers and giving it a gentle squeeze. The 6-year-old boy looked up at his mother's tear-soaked face, then spoke in a voice so gentle it was startling. "Mom, he needs to know, so he can protect us." Willa looked down at her son. Her 6-year-old child was standing here in the middle of a room filled with security screens and cold light, speaking to her about protection. The child she had tried to shield from every shadow life could cast had now become the one urging her to face the past. Willa lifted her head and looked at Reed. Her amber-brown eyes were red and swollen from tears, but in them there was beginning to appear something that looked like resolve. She drew in a deep breath, trying to gather some fragment of the composure that had shattered the moment she saw Miles's drawing. "It's Brody," she said, her voice sounding as though it had broken into 100 pieces. "My husband." Reed showed no surprise. His face remained as cold as ice, not a single muscle moving. "Your former husband," he corrected in an even tone. "I heard he left 2 years ago." Willa nodded, and fresh tears spilled over. "I thought so too. He disappeared. One day he was home, and the next he wasn't. He only left behind a mountain of debt. Strangers came to the door, putting pressure on me, demanding money. I didn't know where he'd gone. I thought he was. Gone." Her voice caught on the final word. Gone. Dead. For 2 years she had believed her husband was dead. She had mourned him, tried to forget him, tried to build a life again for herself and her sons. And now it was all collapsing. Reed looked at her with penetrating intensity, his eyes weighing every word she said. "But you never saw proof. It wasn't a question." Again, it was a statement. Willa shook her head, tears sliding down her cheeks. "No, no one told me anything. There was no news, no body, no funeral. He just vanished, as if he'd never existed." Knox pressed closer to his mother, his small hand gripping her shirt. He didn't understand everything the adults were saying, but he understood that his mother was hurting, and that was enough to make him afraid. Reed continued, his voice colder now, sharper. "He owed money to Cornelius Vance, didn't he?" Willa jerked as though struck by electricity. Her eyes widened, fear and shock colliding inside them. You know?" Reed didn't answer directly. He walked toward the largest screen on the wall and turned his back to her. His silhouette stretched across the blue glow of the screen, large and unsettling. "I know many things, Miss Morrison," Reed said, his voice carrying through the sealed room. "I know you were a witness to an incident involving Vance. You saw something you weren't supposed to see. That night at the South Harbor. You were there." Willa took a step back, her face drained white. "I didn't. I was only passing by. I didn't mean to." Reed turned back to face her, his eyes piercing. "You saw Vance and his men dealing with a traitor. You saw his face. And Vance never lets witnesses live." Willa stood frozen, unable to speak. That night, that terrible night she had tried so hard to erase, the night she had wandered into the harbor while looking for her husband, and had witnessed something so horrifying that she hadn't slept peacefully for months afterward. Reed went on, his voice lower now. "That's why I let you work here. In my mansion. Under my protection." Willa stared at him, her eyes filled with confusion. You knew from the beginning?" "I knew Vance wanted you gone," Reed replied, without directly answering her question. "And I knew you had nowhere else to go. A single mother with 2 small children, no job, no family, being threatened by one of the most dangerous kingpins in the city. You needed shelter. I had it." Miles stood beside his mother, looking at Reed with an expression that held both astonishment and the beginning of understanding. The powerful kingpin all of New York feared, the man everyone believed was cold and ruthless, had been quietly protecting his mother all this time. Reed continued, his voice low as distant thunder. "But there was one thing I didn't know." He paused, then turned fully to face Willa. His eyes locked onto her tear-drenched brown ones. "I didn't know your husband was still alive." A heavy silence fell. "And I didn't know he was working for Vance." Willa looked as if lightning had struck her. Her whole body went rigid, her eyes wide with horror. "Working for Vance? No, that's impossible. Brody would never." Reed cut her off, his voice cold as ice. "He was in my house last night, Miss Morrison. He walked through the hallway behind the kitchen, right beside your room, without triggering a single alert. He knew the layout of the mansion, knew where the cameras were, knew the guards' patrol schedule. Who gave him those things if not someone on the inside?" Willa collapsed into the nearest chair, her legs no longer strong enough to hold her up. She covered her face with both hands, and her broken sobs filled the room, drenched in cold blue light. Brody, the man she had once loved, the father of her 2 children, the man she had thought was dead, mourned, and tried to forget. He was alive, and he was working for the man who wanted her dead. Miles stepped forward and wrapped his arms around his mother. His small arms circled Willa's shoulders and held on tightly. Knox ran to her too, and hugged her from the other side. The 2 boys held the woman who was falling apart, saying nothing, simply staying with her. But the look in Miles's eyes when he turned toward Reed wasn't fear. It wasn't blame. It was the look of a child who had begun to understand that the world of adults was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. It was the look of a child who had seen darkness and still chosen to believe in light, still chosen to trust the man standing in front of him, because Miles knew that in that room, Reed Ashford was the only person who could protect his family. Reed's phone vibrated, breaking the heavy silence in the control room. The screen lit up with an unknown number, no name attached, only a string of unfamiliar digits. Reed looked down at the phone in his hand, his eyes narrowing. Reg stepped closer, his voice low and wary. "You shouldn't answer it, sir. It could be a trap." Reed didn't respond right away. He studied the screen for a long moment, his thumb brushing lightly along the edge of the phone. In 20 years, he had taken more calls like this than he could count. Threats, bargains, warnings, and he was still standing here, still breathing, while most of the men on the other end of those calls were deep in the cold ground. "Put it on speaker," Reed ordered. Then he turned to look at Miles and Knox, standing beside their mother. "But get the boys into the next room first." As if hearing his name spoken, the control room door opened. Patty appeared in the doorway, the silver-haired housekeeper with the kind but stern face. She had worked for the Ashford family since before Reed was born, and she understood everything without needing it explained. She gave a small nod and walked over to the 2 boys. "Miles, Knox, come with me. I've got cookies in the kitchen that just came out of the oven." Knox looked at his mother, hesitant. Miles took his brother's hand, nodded to Willa as if to say everything would be all right, then led Knox out with Patty. The door closed behind them with a soft click. The room was left with only Reed, Willa, and Reg. Reed pressed the button to answer and switched on speaker at the same time. The phone screen shifted into a video call. A dark room appeared. Weak light from a single overhead bulb spilled downward, creating blotches of brightness and shadow. And in the middle of the room, a woman sat in a wooden chair. Her head was bowed. Dark brown hair hid her face. Her frame was slight, painfully familiar. She looked like Willa. Willa stood beside Reed, her eyes widening in horror as she stared at the screen. She was looking at herself, or someone who looked exactly like her, sitting in that dark room. Her heart seemed to stop for a single terrible beat. A man's voice came from the phone, cold and slow, each word dropping like a stone into icy water. "Ashford, she's here with us," Willa whispered, her voice shaking. Is that me?" Reed didn't look at her. His eyes stayed fixed on the screen, studying every smallest detail in the frame. The room, the chair, the light bulb, and the woman sitting there. "No," he said, his tone as calm as if he were commenting on the weather. "You're standing here." The man's voice continued, unconcerned with whether Reed reacted or not. 15 minutes. Come back to the east intersection. Alone, or she'll never come home." The video cut out. The phone screen went black again. Heavy silence dropped over the room like a thick wool blanket. Willa trembled, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to keep from falling apart. They made a fake video, but it looks so much like me. The hair, the body, even the way she's sitting, Reed answered shortly, his voice without the slightest shake. "A deep fake. The technology isn't hard to get if you have money and photos of you. Vance has both." Reg spoke, tension in his voice. "What are you going to do, sir?" Reed didn't answer at once. He stood still for a moment, his eyes fixed on nothing as though he were arranging the scattered pieces in his mind. Then he gave an order. "Open the door. Bring Miles in." The door opened. Miles stepped inside, his face calm as if he had known he would be called. He stood in front of Reed, his brown eyes looking straight at him without a trace of fear. Reed crouched down until they were eye level. His voice softened a little, though the seriousness remained. Do you remember the living room in your old house? There was a wooden chair. Miles nodded. The chair had a scratch on the right armrest. Knox and I used to sit there and watch TV. Dad? The boy stopped for a second and swallowed. Dad bought it from a second-hand store. Reed nodded and went on. We just watched a video. There was a wooden chair in it. Was it the same one? Miles thought for a moment, his brow furrowing. I didn't see the video, but if it had that chair, with the scratch on the right armrest, then they filmed it in our old house. Reed straightened up, just as he had thought. They had used Willa's old house to make the fake video. That meant they still had access to it, or they had taken it over long ago. Knox came rushing in after his brother, breathing hard. He had been listening at the door and couldn't hold himself back any longer. And the man's voice too, Knox said, his round eyes wide. I heard it. I remember that voice. Willa turned toward her son, shocked. Where did you hear it? Knox shook his head. At the playground. Last week. A man came up to me and Miles. He asked what our names were, where we lived, where Mom worked. Willa felt as if someone had punched her in the chest. Someone had approached her children? At the playground? The one place she had thought was safe? Why didn't you tell me? Willa asked, her voice breaking. Knox gave a little shrug. I didn't tell him anything. You told us not to. Don't talk to strangers. Don't give out our address. Don't go with anyone. I remembered. But I remembered his voice too. Raspy, slow, like he was trying not to cough. Reed stood in silence, listening. Piece by piece, the puzzle was beginning to lock into place in his mind. The truck parked there for 3 days. Brody slipping into the mansion last night. The fake video filmed in Willa's old house. The stranger approaching the twins at the playground. This wasn't impulsive. This was a plan. They've been watching your family since before I knew, Reed said, his voice low as distant thunder. Since before you came to work here, maybe since before Brody disappeared. Willa stood frozen, tears sliding down her cheeks. She couldn't say a word. She didn't know what words there even were. Her whole life, and the lives of her children, had been under the eye of an enemy she never even knew was there. Reg stepped closer to Reed, his voice low. This has been planned for a long time, sir. They prepared it carefully. Reed nodded, his eyes cold as steel. And today is the day they make their move. Reg asked the question bluntly, his voice drawn tight as a wire. Are you going to that intersection? The question hung in the air of the control room. Blue light still flickered from the monitors, casting its glow over strained faces. 15 minutes. That was the deadline they had given him. 15 minutes for Reed Ashford to decide whether he would step into the trap they had already laid for him. Reed was silent. He didn't look at Reg. He didn't look at the phone still lying on the table. His eyes turned instead toward Willa and the twins standing in the corner of the room. Miles was still calm, his brown eyes taking everything in. Knox pressed close to his mother, his small hand clutched tightly around her shirt. Willa trembled, her reddened eyes fixed on Reed with open worry. She didn't know what to expect from this man. She asked in a small, shaking voice, If you go, what will they do? Reed answered in a steady tone, as though he were speaking of something obvious. They'll stage an ambush. The east intersection is the perfect place for it. 3 high-rise buildings around it, 2 alleyways leading out, and an overpass above. They'll wait for me to arrive, then close every exit. He paused for a second, then added, exactly as Miles warned. Miles stepped forward, leaving his mother's side to stand in front of Reed. He had to tilt his head back just to look up at the face of the man who stood nearly a yard taller than he was. But he didn't show fear. His brown eyes locked onto Reed's gray ones, steady and resolute. I told you, Miles said, his calm voice ringing clearly through the silent room. You mustn't go back, no matter what happens. Reed looked down at the boy. 6 years old. Not tall enough to see over the balcony railing without rising onto his toes. Not old enough to tie his own shoes without help. But this child had done what Reed's 20 most seasoned bodyguards had failed to do. The boy had seen the danger, had given warning, had saved his life without even knowing it. Reed had met many people in his life. Ruthless kings, cunning politicians, cold-blooded killers. But he had never met anyone braver than the 6-year-old boy standing before him now. I'm not going, Reed said. Willa let out a breath, and her shoulders sagged as if 1,000 pounds had just been lifted from them. Knox tightened his grip on his mother's hand, as though he feared that if he let go, everything would fall apart. But Reg was stunned. He looked at Reed with open confusion. "But the meeting with the council, sir. They're waiting. If you don't go." Reed cut him off, his voice allowing no argument. "The meeting can be postponed. The council can wait. They've waited for me for 20 years. They can wait one more day." He turned to Reg, his eyes sharp as blades. Each order came out clear and final, like the strike of a hammer. "Lock down the estate. Monitor all frequencies. If a call comes in, I want a trace on it immediately. Check every person in this house, from the guards to the staff. I want to know who was where and when. No one comes in or out until I say so." Reg nodded, his face hardening with purpose. "Yes, sir." He turned and strode quickly from the room to carry out the order. Reed looked back at Willa. She was still standing there, her amber-brown eyes fixed on him with gratitude and confusion tangled together. She didn't understand why this man had chosen to stay, instead of going to the important meeting. She didn't understand why he had chosen to protect her, instead of stepping into the trap to prove his strength. "You and the boys are going into the safe room with Patty," Reed said, his tone softening a little, though it kept its firmness. "You'll stay there until I say it's safe. The room is soundproof, insulated, has its own air filtration system, and enough food and water for a week. You'll be all right." Willa nodded, then asked in a voice so quiet it seemed afraid of breaking something fragile, "What about you?" Reed looked at her for a long moment. His gray eyes, for the first time since that morning, held the faintest trace of something warmer. "Not much. Just a glimmer, but Willa saw it. I'm going to deal with the people who think they can threaten those under my roof." Willa blinked. Those under my roof. What had he just said? She wasn't his family. She was only the housekeeper, the woman he had hired to cook and clean, but he had said those under my roof as though she and her sons belonged here, as though they were part of something that was his to protect. Knox tugged on his mother's hand, his voice small. "Mom, let's go. Patty's waiting." Willa nodded and gathered herself. She took both boys by the hand and started toward the door where Patty was waiting. But as she passed Reed, she stopped for 1 second. Only one. She turned her head, looked at him, and whispered 2 words. "Thank you." Reed said nothing. He only gave a slight nod, brief and almost too small to notice, but for Willa, it was all she needed. She stepped out of the room, leading Miles and Knox after Patty. The door closed behind them. The control room was left with only Reed, standing alone amid dozens of monitors flickering with blue light. He stood there, back straight, shoulders broad, looking at the screen that showed the white truck still sitting motionless at the corner. Their 15 minutes were nearly up, and Reed Ashford had no intention of going anywhere. The safe room lay deep in the heart of the mansion, hidden behind 3 layers of steel doors and a biometric recognition system that only a select few were allowed to access. The steel walls were more than 8 inches thick, completely soundproof, sealing off the world inside from every sound beyond them. There were no windows, no cameras showing the outside. Once the door shut with the sharp click of the electronic lock, they would have no way of knowing what was happening on the other side. It was protection, and at the same time, a frightening kind of isolation. Willa sat on the gray velvet sofa in the center of the room, both arms wrapped tightly around Miles and Knox as if she feared that if she let go, someone would snatch her children away. The room was larger than she had expected, furnished like a small apartment, with a compact kitchen, a bathroom, and several neatly made folding beds tucked into one corner. Soft golden light fell from the ceiling, doing its best to create a sense of warmth within those cold steel walls. Patty stood beside the sealed steel door, wearing the calm expression of someone long accustomed to moments of crisis. Her lined hands were folded together in front of her stomach, not trembling at all. 20 years inside the Ashford mansion had taught her that panic never solved anything. Knox shifted restlessly in his mother's arms, his wide, round eyes taking in the unfamiliar room. He asked softly, his young voice carrying through the silence. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" Willa stroked her son's softly curling hair and tried to smile in reassurance, though her lips were still trembling. "We're going to be okay, sweetheart. Mr. Ashford will protect us." She said it. And for the first time in 2 years, she truly believed the words as they left her mouth. Miles stayed quiet, sitting beside his mother, the little sketchbook of rough drawings still resting in his lap. He didn't draw anything more. He only sat there, his brown eyes fixed on nothing, as if thinking about something very far away. His 6-year-old mind was trying to fit together the pieces the adults had accidentally dropped in front of him. Dad is alive. Dad works for bad people. Dad wants to hurt Mom. Those pieces didn't fit with the memories he still carried. Memories of the man who used to lift him onto his shoulders, who told bedtime stories, who bought ice cream for the two brothers every Saturday afternoon. Knox turned toward Patty, curiosity in his eyes. "Miss Patty, is Mr. Ashford really good at this?" Patty smiled, the smile of a grandmotherly woman who had witnessed too many rises and falls to count. "He's very good at it, sweetheart. Better than anyone I've ever known. No one has ever been able to harm the people he protects. Not once." Knox seemed satisfied with the answer. He leaned his head against his mother's shoulder, his eyes beginning to drift shut. Tension and fear had drained every bit of energy from the little boy. Willa looked at Patty, curiosity flickering through her worry. "Have you worked for him a long time?" Patty nodded, her voice lowering as if she were reaching back into distant years. 20 years. Since before he was anybody. Back when he was just a thin young man with cold eyes and hands that held nothing but determination. Willa was startled. She had always assumed Reed Ashford had been born powerful, born wealthy, born the kingpin the whole city feared. She had never imagined there had once been a time when he had been nothing at all. Miles lifted his head, his brown eyes settling on Patty with unusual seriousness. "Doesn't he have any parents?" Patty looked at the boy, and her expression softened. She knew Miles was a special child. Observant, quiet, able to understand things grown-ups assumed children couldn't possibly grasp. "He was orphaned when he was very young, sweetheart," Patty said gently, as though telling an old story. "He grew up in homes, then on the streets. He had no one to lean on except himself. He built everything he has today with his own 2 hands. Knox, even though he was half asleep, still heard her. He tipped his head slightly and asked in a drowsy voice, "Then is he lonely?" The innocent question from a 6-year-old child made the room fall silent. Patty said nothing for a long while. Her old eyes turned toward the steel door, as if she could see through it, as if she could see Reed standing alone in the control room, facing his enemies the way he had faced everything in life. "Alone." "Yes, sweetheart," Patty finally said, her voice almost like a sigh. "He's very lonely. In all the 20 years I've been here, I've never seen him truly close to anyone. He's never really had a family." Willa looked toward the steel door, and her heart tightened with a feeling she couldn't even name. The man all of New York feared, the most powerful man in the city, the man who had just said he would protect those under his roof, had never had a family, had lived alone his whole life. Silence stretched out. No one said anything else. There was only the steady breathing of Knox, already asleep in his mother's arms, and the faint hum of the air filtration system in the corner. Then suddenly, the phone in Willa's pocket vibrated. Willa flinched so hard she nearly dropped the sleeping boy. She quickly eased Knox down onto the sofa, then pulled out her phone and looked at the screen. And she froze. The old number. The string of digits she had deleted from her contacts 2 years earlier. The number she had believed was gone when its owner disappeared. Brody's number. Willa's face went white as paper. Her hand shook so badly she nearly dropped the phone. The screen was still glowing, still showing that familiar number, familiar enough to hurt, still vibrating again and again as if reminding her that the past never truly died. Miles looked at his mother, alertness flashing into his eyes. "Mom, who's calling?" Willa didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat had closed up, every word that wanted to come dying on her tongue. Her hand trembled as she held the phone that kept vibrating, the bright screen like the eye of a demon staring through the dark. That number wasn't supposed to exist. That man wasn't supposed to still be alive. But the screen didn't lie, and Brody was calling. The phone kept vibrating, the steady hum sounding through the silence of the safe room like the countdown of a timed bomb. Willa stared at the screen as if hypnotized, her amber brown eyes unable to leave the familiar number flashing there, the number of the past, the number of the husband she had believed was dead. Patty stepped closer, her aged eyes resting on Willa with concern. "Who's calling, dear?" Willa didn't answer. She couldn't. Her trembling finger moved as if it had a will of its own, pressing the answer button before her mind could tell it to stop. She didn't put the call on speaker, but in the breathless silence of the room, everyone heard the man's voice from the other end clearly. Willa. One word. Just one. But it was enough to make Willa's whole body go rigid. That familiar voice. That deep, warm voice she had once loved. The the voice she heard every night in her dreams, only to wake with her pillow soaked in tears when she remembered he was gone. But that voice was there now, right now, coming through the phone in her hand. Willa choked on a breath, her lips moving before she finally managed to force out a single word. Brody? Miles and Knox both startled when they heard that name. Knox, who had just drifted to sleep in his mother's arms, sat bolt upright, his round eyes wide as he stared at the phone as though it were some creature from another world. He pressed himself against his mother, his small hand clutching her shirt, tears already filling his eyes even though he didn't understand why he suddenly wanted to cry. Miles was different. The boy stood up, his back straight, his brown eyes fixed on the phone as if he were looking at an enemy. No fear, no surprise, only the cold wariness of a child who had already learned that not everyone could be trusted. Brody's voice went on through the phone, the voice of a man trying to stay calm, though something urgent trembled beneath it. Can you hear me? You and the boys need to get out of there. Right now. There's no time to explain. Willa asked, her voice shattered like broken glass. Where are you? You're alive? 2 years, Brody. Where have you been for 2 years? Why didn't you contact us? Why did you let us think you were dead? I'll explain later, Brody said, his voice rushed. Right now, you need to listen to me. East gate of the estate, 10 minutes. Come alone with the boys. Don't tell anyone. Don't tell Ashford. Willa rose to her feet, her whole body shaking like a leaf in a storm. Pain, anger, fear, all of it twisted together into a storm inside her chest. You left us, she said, her voice almost a scream forced down into something smaller. 2 years. You left us to live in fear, not knowing whether you were alive or dead. Debt collectors came pounding on the door in the middle of the night. I had to take the boys and run from one place to another. I cried until I had no tears left because I thought my husband had been killed. And now you call and tell me to come with you, as if none of that ever happened? Silence on the other end of the line. 1 second. 2. 3. Then Brody spoke again, his voice lower, as if he were trying to explain something he already knew would never be accepted. I did what I had to do, to protect my family. Protect? Willa laughed, and the bitter sound echoed through the steel room. You call that protection? Leaving your wife and children without a word? Letting them live in fear for 2 years? That's how you protect your family? Brody went on, his voice more strained now. Ashford is a dangerous man, Willa. You shouldn't be there. The boys shouldn't be there. He's not a good man. He's just using you for his own reasons. Willa shook her head, even though she knew Brody couldn't see it. He's the only person who gave us a place to live when you disappeared. He's the only one who protected us when people came to pressure us. He didn't abandon us the way you did. Knox, hearing the voice of the man he had once called Daddy, couldn't hold back any longer. Tears spilled down his cheeks, and the boy whispered in a small, broken voice, Dad? Brody's voice softened when he heard his son's voice. Knox? Is that you? Are you okay? I miss you so much. I miss Miles too. I'm sorry I had to go away, but I did everything for you boys. Miles stepped forward and stood beside his mother, his voice cutting in cold as ice. You're not our father anymore. Heavy silence fell on the other end of the line. Willa looked at her son, stunned. Miles, 6 years old, was standing there with his shoulders straight and his gaze steady, speaking the words she hadn't been able to say herself. Brody answered, his voice stretched tight as a wire ready to snap. Miles, you don't understand. I did everything for our family. I had to leave to protect your mother and your brother. If I'd stayed, they would have. You left, Mom. Miles cut in, giving Brody no chance to explain. You let her cry every night. I heard it all. I lay in my room and heard her crying into her pillow, thinking I didn't know. But I knew. I heard everything. Willa looked at her son, tears spilling down her face. She had thought she had hidden it so well. Thought that on the nights she cried alone in her room, the boys had never known. But Miles had known. The boy had heard. He had understood. He had carried that pain in silence while she tried to shield him from it. Miles went on, his voice so calm it was almost frightening. Calm in a way that didn't belong to a 6-year-old child but to a grown man who had already seen too much of the world. Mr. Ashford didn't leave. He's here. He's protecting us. He said we're under his roof. We're not going anywhere. Brody was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was no longer gentle the way it had been with Knox. It was cold, hard, the voice of a man delivering an ultimatum. Willa, you have 10 minutes to think. East Gate. If you don't come out, I can't guarantee what happens next. The call ended. The dead tone sounded for a moment, then stopped. Willa stared at the phone in her hand, the screen gone dark now, reflecting only her pale face back at her. Then she looked at her sons. Knox was still crying, tears running down his round cheeks, not understanding what was happening but knowing it was bad. Miles stood straight, his small hands clenched into fists, ready to protect his mother and his brother from whatever was coming next. Silence settled over the safe room like a heavy blanket falling across each person inside. Only the soft sound of Knox crying, those small broken sobs rising at steady intervals, and Willa's quick breathing as she struggled to control the panic swelling in her chest, disturbed the stillness. 10 minutes. Brody had given her 10 minutes to decide. The phone in her hand now felt as heavy as 1,000 tons, each passing second a reminder that time was running out. Patty stepped forward, her lined hands resting gently on Willa's shoulders. Her voice was calm as the surface of a still lake, the voice of someone who had seen too many storms to be shaken by a little wind. You mustn't go outside. Willa nodded, her eyes still fixed on the phone in her hand as if it might somehow offer her an answer. I know. She did know. Of course she knew. The East Gate was a trap. Brody hadn't called to lead her somewhere safe. He had called to lure her into the wolf's den. The man she had once loved, the father of her 2 sons, was now working for the man who wanted her dead. That truth hurt more deeply than any blade ever could. Knox pressed close to his mother, tears soaking his round little face. He didn't understand everything that was happening, but he understood that Daddy had called, that Daddy wanted them to come, and that Mommy was crying. Mom, Knox whispered, his voice trembling. Dad wants us to go. Willa held him close, her hand stroking the soft curls of his hair the way she had done 1,000 times before, every time he had been frightened or sad. I know, sweetheart. I know, but Miles was different. The boy stood in front of his mother and brother, his back straight, his shoulders as broad as a 6-year-old body could manage, like a little soldier standing guard at the door. His brown eyes no longer carried the innocence of childhood. They looked older now, resolute, filled with fierce protectiveness for the people he loved. Mom, Miles said, his voice so steady that Willa had to lift her head and look at him. He left us. He left you alone with us. 2 years. For 2 years you had to do everything by yourself. Work, cook, take me to school, pay the rent, take care of everything. He wasn't there. Willa looked at her older son, tears spilling down her cheeks. She wanted to say something, wanted to explain, wanted to protect the image of their father in her sons' hearts, but she couldn't, because everything Miles said was true. Miles. I don't want to go with someone who abandoned us, Miles continued, his voice unshaken. I like it here. I like Mr. Ashford. He gave us our own rooms. He never yells at you. He said we're under his roof. Knox looked up and nodded through his tears. I like it too. Mr. Ashford gives us good food. Miss Patty bakes cookies for us. Our room has big windows that look out at the garden. In the old house, we had to sleep in the same bed because the room was too small. Willa looked at her children, the children she had fought to protect for 2 long years, now standing before her and telling her what they wanted. They wanted to stay. They had found safety in this place, inside the mansion of the Mafia kingpin the whole city feared, and they didn't want to leave. Willa pulled both boys tightly into her arms and wept. Her tears fell onto Miles's and Knox's hair, mingling with pain and with a strange, unexpected relief. She didn't have to make the choice alone. Her sons had already chosen. Patty stood quietly by the door, watching the scene unfold before her with old eyes that had seen too many rises and falls in life. She knew this was an important moment, a moment that would change the lives of all 3 of them, a moment when they chose the future over the past. Willa whispered, her voice breaking. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry you have to go through this. I'm sorry your father. Miles shook his head and cut her off. It's not your fault. It's Dad's fault. He's the one who chose to leave. You're the one who chose to stay. Knox nodded in agreement. You're the best mom in the whole world. I love you the most. Willa smiled through her tears, the first smile she had managed since Brody's call came through. She held her sons tighter, feeling the warmth of their small bodies leaning into hers. This was her family. This was everything she needed. After a while, Willa lifted her head and looked at Patty. Her amber brown eyes were still swollen with tears, but there was resolve in them now. We're staying here, she said, her voice clear though still unsteady. "We're not going anywhere." Patty nodded and smiled softly. It was the smile of someone who had lived long enough to know when a person had made the right choice. "The right decision, dear. The master will be very glad to hear it." Willa looked down at the phone in her hand. The screen was black and still, but it still held Brody's number in her contacts. The number of the past. The number of betrayal. The number of the man who had abandoned her. She opened her contacts, found Brody's number, and deleted it. No hesitation. No regret. "The past is over," she whispered, mostly to herself more than to anyone else. "Now we look forward." Miles nodded, and for the first time, a small smile touched his face. The smile of a child who had carried too much and had finally begun to see the light. Knox wiped his tears away with the back of his hand, then asked, his voice still thick with emotion. "Mom, will Mr. Ashford come back? He said he'd protect us." Willa looked toward the steel door, the barrier that separated them from the outside world, where Reed was facing the people threatening her family. "I believe he'll come back," she said, and for the first time in a very long while, she truly believed the words she was saying. As if in answer to her, footsteps sounded outside the safe room. Steady, certain, the footsteps of a familiar man. The soft beep of the biometric system sounded, and then the steel door slowly opened. Reed Ashford stood there, his clothes still perfectly ordered without a single wrinkle, his eyes moving over the three of them in a glance that was quick yet thorough, checking whether they were safe, checking whether anyone was hurt, checking whether everything was all right. His gaze came to rest on Willa's tear-stained face, then moved down to Miles and Knox, standing close against their mother. And in that moment, something flickered through those icy gray eyes, a trace of warmth, a trace of relief. As if he had just found something he had been searching for all along, for 20 years, without ever knowing it. Reed stepped into the safe room, his stride as steady as ever, without a single sign that he had just been through anything tense. Reg followed behind him, the bodyguard's face wearing its usual grave expression, though his eyes swept quickly across the room, checking everything the way habit had long since settled into his blood. Knox slid off the sofa, his little feet touching the floor, and started to run toward Reed the way he always did whenever he saw someone he liked. But then he stopped, suddenly shy, standing a few steps away, his wide round eyes still wet with tears as he looked up at the tall kingpin. The little boy didn't know whether he should run into his arms or not, didn't know whether that would be allowed, didn't know whether Reed would want that or not. Reed looked at Knox, his eyes passing over the round face still damp with tears. Then he looked at Miles, standing straight beside his mother with the solemn expression of a little soldier who had just finished carrying out his duty. Then he looked at Willa. His gaze stopped on her reddened eyes, on the tear tracks still clinging to her cheeks, on the way her hands were still trembling slightly despite all her effort to control them. He saw all of it, understood all of it. "Everything's been handled," Reed said, his voice as even as if he were giving a report about the weather. "The truck has left. The men inside have been identified. They didn't get into the estate." Willa let out a long breath, her shoulders sagging as though 1,000 pounds had finally been lifted from them. She asked in a small voice, as though afraid of the answer. And Brody?" Reed answered in a tone without the slightest emotion, cold as winter ice. "We have him. Reg just informed me they intercepted him near the east gate. He's already in custody and talking. He won't be threatening you again." Willa nodded, and didn't ask anything more. She didn't want to know the details, didn't want to know what Reed had done to make sure Brody wouldn't come back. There were things she didn't need to know, things she shouldn't know, and things she chose not to know so that she could go on living. Reed looked at her for a long moment, his eyes seeming to read every thought in her mind. "He called you." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Reed knew. "Of course he knew," Willa answered, her voice faintly trembling. "You knew?" Reed gave a slight nod. "I know about every call that comes in and out of this estate. Even when signals are blocked, the system still records them. I know he called you. I know what he said. I know he wanted you at the east gate in 10 minutes. Heavy silence filled the room. Willa didn't know what she was supposed to say. Reed had heard everything, knew everything, even knew that Brody had told her to leave, knew what Miles had said to his own father. Reed asked, his voice still steady, but with something else inside it, something Willa couldn't quite name. "You didn't go?" Willa looked at the two boys standing beside her, then looked back at Reed. Her amber brown eyes met his icy gray ones, and she answered in a clear voice, without the slightest hesitation. "No, we're staying here." Miles stepped forward and stood beside his mother, lifting his head to look at Reed. "We made our decision," the boy said, his voice firm in a way that sounded almost grown. "We don't want to go with someone who abandoned us. We want to stay here, with Mom, and with you." Reed looked at the boy, his eyes unreadable as always, but something in them had changed, a trace of warmth, a trace of softness, even if only for a moment. After a while, he gave a slight nod, just one brief nod. "Good." Only one word. But Willa saw Reed's shoulders ease just a little, saw the tension in his face soften by the smallest degree, as if he had been waiting for that answer, as if he had been afraid the answer might be different. Knox, sensing the room had gentled, crept one step closer to Reed. He tilted his head up, his round eyes fixed on the tall kingpin. "Mr. Ashford, are you okay?" Reed looked down at the boy, and for the first time since entering the room, something like the shadow of a smile passed over his mouth. "I'm fine, Knox." Reed turned to Reg, and his voice became cold again, the way it usually was. "Get the car ready. I have a meeting to attend." Willa stared in surprise, her eyes widening. "You're still going? After everything that just happened?" Reed looked at her, his eyes sharp as tempered steel. "Someone needs to face the consequences for what they did today, and I'm going to make sure that happens." Reed was getting ready to leave. He stood before the tall mirror in the safe room, straightening his charcoal gray suit jacket, smoothing every fold along the lapels until they lay perfectly flat. The Patek Philippe on his wrist caught the warm yellow light, its second hand moving with steady, measured certainty, like the heartbeat of the man who wore it. Calm, certain, not the slightest tremor. Willa stood watching him, her amber brown eyes still shadowed by worry that hadn't yet faded. She knew Reed was about to step into the lion's den, knew he was going to face the people who had dared to threaten her and her sons, knew that in the underworld, everything could change in a single instant. "You're going to meet the council," she said, her voice quiet and faintly unsteady. "Is it dangerous?" Reed answered shortly, without turning to look at her. "Not for me." He paused for a beat, then added, his voice cold as ice. "For Vance, yes." Willa didn't ask anything more. She understood that there were things Reed didn't say, not because he didn't want to, but because she wasn't meant to know them. His world had its own rules, its own secrets, and she was only someone standing at the edge of it. But somehow, she believed he would be all right. Reed turned to Patty, the silver-haired housekeeper who was still standing quietly beside the steel door. "Stay here with them. No one goes outside until I come back. If anything happens, call Reg immediately." Patty nodded, her old eyes still bright with resolve. "Yes, sir. I'll protect them with my life if I have to." Reed gave a short nod, then started toward the door. His footsteps were even and steady, as though he were heading out for a walk in the park, rather than preparing to face the most dangerous enemies in the city. But before he could step outside, a small voice rose in the quiet room. "You'll come back, won't you?" Reed stopped. His foot froze at the threshold as though someone had pressed pause on time itself. He turned around. Miles was standing there in the middle of the room, his little sketchbook still in his hand, his brown eyes fixed on Reed without blinking. The boy wasn't crying, wasn't trembling. He was simply standing there and asking the simplest question in the world. "You'll come back, won't you?" Reed stood still for a long moment. In the last 20 years, he had heard countless questions. Questions about money, power, deals, lives. Questions from allies, from enemies, from people begging and from people threatening. But never, not once, had anyone asked him that. How long had it been since anyone had asked whether he would come back? Had there ever been anyone waiting for him to return? Reed lowered himself, bending down onto one knee so that his eyes were level with the boy's. The distance between the powerful kingpin and the 6-year-old child narrowed to only a few inches. His eyes looked into those clear brown ones. "I'll come back," Reed said, his voice lower than usual, as though he were saying something more important than any business deal he had ever made. Miles didn't blink. "Do you promise?" Reed was silent. He never made promises. In 20 years, he had learned that promises were the easiest things in the world to break. People promised loyalty and then betrayed you, promised protection and then ran, promised love and then left. Promises were only empty words people used to make others trust them before stabbing them in the back. But looking into the boy's eyes, Reed saw something else. Not innocence, not weakness. Faith. The pure faith of a child who had chosen to trust him even while knowing how cruel the world could be. Reed nodded. I promise. 2 words. Only 2 words, but they carried more weight than any multi-million-dollar contract he had ever signed. Miles gave a small smile, his first smile since that morning. Then he stepped back and took his place beside his mother, as though he had completed the task he had been given. Knox, not wanting to be left out, ran over to stand beside his brother. The little boy waved at Reed, his round eyes shining. Be careful, and come back soon. Miss Patty's gonna make cookies and wait for you. Reed looked at the 2 boys standing side by side, then at Willa behind them. She said nothing, her lips pressed together, but her amber brown eyes were filled with things that couldn't be spoken aloud. Worry, gratitude, trust, and something else Reed didn't dare give a name to. He gave her a slight nod, then turned and walked out of the room. Reg followed behind him, and the steel door shut with a click that sounded like the final period at the end of a sentence. They moved down the hallway, their footsteps echoing in steady rhythm across the polished marble floor. Reed said nothing, but in his mind, the promise he had made to the 6-year-old boy kept echoing over and over. I promise. I'll come back. In 20 years, Reed Ashford had never promised anyone anything, and now he had promised a 6-year-old child that he would return. That promise weighed more heavily than any deal he had ever signed, more heavily than any life he had ever held in his hands, because for the first time in his life, someone was waiting for him. The Continental sat hidden in a narrow alley in the heart of Manhattan, with no sign, no windows facing the street, only a heavy oak door with a brass handle dulled by time. An ordinary passerby would think it was nothing more than an abandoned warehouse, but those who belonged to the underworld knew this was where the heads of New York met in secret. The place where real power was decided, not in glittering skyscrapers or polished boardrooms, but in a dim room with thick walls that could shut out any listening device. Reed stepped inside, with Reg beside him like a faithful shadow. Warm yellow light from old chandeliers spilled down over the long oak table in the center of the room, its glossy surface reflecting the faces seated around it. 5 men, the kingpins of New York's underworld. Garrett sat at the head of the table, the oldest among them, his hair white as snow, his deep-set eyes carrying the wisdom of a man who had seen far too much. Franklin sat to Garrett's right, the man who controlled the South Harbor, massive as a bear. Harrison and Bennett sat across from each other, the 2 brothers who together held the city's underground construction and real estate empire. And at the far end of the table, facing the empty chair reserved for Reed, sat Cornelius Vance, 50 years old, salt and pepper hair slicked back, a sharply cut face with eyes as cunning as an old fox. He wore a dark blue suit and a red tie, lounging in his chair as though he were sitting in his own parlor. When he saw Reed walk in, Vance smiled, the smile of a man who thought he had already won. Ashford, I didn't think you'd make it. I heard you had a little trouble at home this morning. Reed didn't return the smile. He pulled out his chair and sat down, the movement as casual as if he were taking his place at breakfast. I get anywhere I want to go. Vance let out a soft laugh and leaned forward. I suppose you were busy this morning, dealing with a few minor problems? Heard someone threatened your maid or something like that. Reed didn't answer. He only looked at Vance with gray eyes as cold as steel tempered in ice. That look held no anger, no hatred, only the cold calculation of a man waiting for the right moment. Garrett, unwilling to waste time on taunts, tapped his finger lightly against the table. Can we begin? I haven't got all day. There's a shipment that needs handling before tonight. Reed nodded, but not to agree to start the meeting the way Garrett expected. I didn't come here for a meeting. Silence swept over the room. 5 pairs of eyes turned toward Reed. Garrett frowned, the lines in his forehead deepening. Then why are you here? Reed didn't answer with words. He slid a hand into his suit pocket and pulled out a small black flash drive. He placed it on the polished oak table, then nudged it gently toward the center with one finger. To accuse. Vance burst into loud laughter, the sound ringing through the sealed room like the cry of a crow. Accuse? Accuse me of what? What evidence do you have? Or are you planning to make up stories in front of the council? Reed didn't smile. He looked straight into Vance's eyes, his gray gaze unblinking, his voice slow and clear, each word falling as if he were reading out a death sentence. You broke the rule, Garrett asked, his tone turning more serious. "Which rule?" Reed answered, every word dropping like a hammer. "He went after family, women and children." A heavy silence settled over the room. No one spoke. No one moved. In the underworld, there were many unspoken rules that everyone knew, but one rule stood above all the others. One line no one was allowed to cross, no matter how much power or money they had. You don't touch women and children. It wasn't just a rule. It was law, and anyone who broke it would pay. Vance shot to his feet, his chair scraping backward with a harsh cry, his face flushed dark with rage. "She isn't your family. She's just a servant, some worthless little maid. You don't get to use that rule against me." Reed rose as well, slowly, calmly, like a panther stretching before the kill. His voice remained cold as ice, untouched by Vance's fury. "She lives in my house, eats my food, sleeps under my roof. Her boys call me sir. They play in my garden, and are protected by my men. She and her sons are under my protection." He looked around the table, his eyes passing over each kingpin, each face listening with sharp attention. "On this flash drive is footage from my security cameras. There are recordings of the threats sent to my phone this morning, and there is testimony from a man who once worked for Vance, confirming that he gave orders to watch, threaten, and plan harm against a woman and 2 children living under my protection." Garrett picked up the flash drive, turning it over in his hand, then signaled to a technician standing in the corner of the room to step forward. Vance shouted, his voice ripping through the air. "This is slander. Lies. You don't have any real evidence. Who's going to believe a maid and a couple of children?" Reed smiled then, a smile as cold as ice. "Brody Morrison, the woman's former husband. He confessed to everything, every detail, every order, every call from you. He talked in exchange for his life." Vance froze, the color drained from his face in a single instant, and his cunning eyes suddenly filled with panic. Brody had confessed. The man Vance had used as a pawn, the traitor he had trusted, had sold him out to save his own skin. Garrett nodded to the other kingpins around the table, the looks they exchanged wordless but full of meaning. "The council will examine the evidence. If what Ashford says is true..." Reed cut him off, his voice without the slightest hesitation. "You'll see that it's true. Every word I've spoken is backed by proof, and I am demanding that Vance be stripped of power." The technician brought up the contents of the flash drive on the large screen behind them. A white panel dropped down from the ceiling, and the lights in the room dimmed automatically, so everyone could see more clearly. The camera footage, the recordings, Brody's statement, everything appeared in sharp detail. Every frame, every sound, every line of text. First came the footage from the Ashford estate security cameras. The white truck parked on the corner for 3 days. The 2 men taking turns sitting inside it, occasionally lifting their phones to photograph the estate gate. Then came the image of the shadowy figure slipping into the mansion near midnight, moving through the hallway behind the kitchen, avoiding the cameras as if he knew the exact location of every one of them. Next came the recording of the video call. The cold male voice echoed through the meeting room. "Ashford, she's here with us. 15 minutes. Come back to the east intersection, alone, or she'll never come home." And finally, there was Brody Morrison's statement. The screen showed the gaunt man with panic in his eyes, sitting in front of the camera and recounting every detail. "Vance ordered me to get close to Willa. He wanted to use her and the 2 boys as leverage to lure Ashford into a trap. I had to sneak into the mansion and gather information about schedules, camera locations, everything. He said if I didn't do it, he wouldn't wipe out my debt. He said my family would pay the ultimate price if I failed." The kingpins watched in silence. No one spoke. No one moved. The room seemed frozen, with only the recorded voices and the images on the screen continuing to move. When it was over, the screen went dark and the lights in the room came back up. Garrett was the first to speak, his voice heavy as stone. "This is clear evidence. Footage, recordings, testimony. It all lines up." He turned to Vance, his deep-set eyes boring into the man trembling at the far end of the table. "Vance, how do you explain this?" Vance's face was flushed dark red, his hands clenched so tightly into fists that his knuckles had gone white. He shot to his feet, the chair crashing to the floor behind him, and shouted like a cornered animal. "That plan was aimed at Ashford, not the woman. I only wanted to bring him down, not hurt those kids. This is war between kingpins. It has nothing to do with the rule about family." Reed answered in a voice cold as winter wind blowing through a graveyard. You used her and those two boys as a way to target me. You had men monitor the family's movements, even tracking their visits to the park to gather information. You made a fake video, used her image to threaten me. You had her former husband sneak into my house in the middle of the night, walk past the room where she and her sons were sleeping. He paused, his eyes sharp as knives. Is that not going after them? If I'd fallen into your trap this morning, if I'd come back the way you wanted, what would have happened to them? Silence. Vance couldn't answer. Franklin, the kingpin who controlled the South Harbor, shook his head slowly. Vance, you know the rule. We all do. No one touches women and children, no matter the reason, no matter the enemy. That's the last line. Harrison nodded in agreement. You could have gone after Ashford in any number of other ways. Business, territory, influence. But you chose to use a woman and two children. That's a violation. Bennett, the quietest man on the council, spoke up as well. I've got a 6-year-old granddaughter. If anyone dared do this to her, I wouldn't wait for the council to vote. Vance looked around, his cunning eyes now full of panic. He searched for an ally, searched for someone who would stand with him, but no one looked at him. Garrett, Franklin, Harrison, Bennett, all of them either turned away or looked at him with open disgust. Garrett stood, carrying the solemn authority of a leader who had seen too much to be shaken easily anymore. The council has heard enough. We need to vote. The 5 kingpins looked at one another, brief nods passing between them through their eyes. No further discussion was needed. The evidence was too clear. The violation was too severe. Garrett announced the decision, his voice sounding through the room like a judge's gavel striking the bench. 4 votes in favor, 1 against. Vance, you're stripped of your place on the council and all related operations. Your territory will be redistributed among the remaining members. You have 24 hours to leave New York. Vance slammed his hand onto the table, the sound exploding through the quiet room. You can't do this. I built this empire over 30 years. You don't have the right to take it from me. Reed looked at Vance, his voice without the slightest trace of emotion, cold as ice and hard as steel. You did this to yourself, Vance. The moment you thought you could threaten the people under my roof and walk away without consequences. The moment you thought you could use children as pieces on a board and no one would object. Vance looked at Reed with blazing hatred, those cunning eyes now burning with fury. This isn't over, Ashford. You think you've won? You think you can bring me down and live in peace? I'll come back. And when I do. Reed rose slowly and fastened his suit jacket again, adjusting his cuff with calm precision. He wasn't rushed, wasn't afraid, didn't care about the empty threats of a man who had already lost. For you, Reed said in a tone as calm as if he were discussing the weather. It is over. He turned his back and walked out of the room, with Reg following like his loyal shadow. The heavy oak door shut behind them, leaving Vance standing alone beneath the cold eyes of the remaining kingpins. Outside, night had already fallen. The city lights flickered like fallen stars scattered across the earth, creating an upside-down sky that was both dazzling and dark. Reed stood on the sidewalk and drew a breath of the cool night air deep into his lungs. He had won. Vance had been stripped of power. The threat had been removed. But what he was thinking about wasn't victory, not power, not the new territory that would now be divided. It was the 3 people waiting for him at home, a woman with amber brown eyes, and 2 little boys who had made him promise he would come back. The Maybach moved through the New York streets at night, its tires gliding smoothly over pavement, still damp with the sheen of late afternoon rain. Yellow light from the tall buildings streamed past the windows like blurred ribbons of gold, creating the portrait of a city that never slept, a city Reed had looked at 1,000 times in his life. But tonight, somehow, everything looked different, brighter, warmer, as though the city itself were welcoming him home. Reg sat in the front beside the driver, glancing now and then into the rearview mirror to check on his employer. At last he spoke, his voice low and respectful. "Are you all right, sir?" It was a tense night. Reed didn't answer right away. He was thinking. His mind was no longer fixed on Vance, on the council, on the power struggles he had known for 20 years. Instead, he was thinking about one question. When was the last time someone had waited for him to come home? The answer came to him with painful clarity. Never. He had been orphaned at 7, when both his mother and father died in what he later learned hadn't been an accident at all. He grew up in orphanages, places where children learn to survive with fists and cunning before they ever learn to read. He left at 15, lived on the streets, did whatever he had to do to survive each day. Then little by little, he climbed. By intelligence, by ruthlessness, by the ability to read people and know what they would do before they knew it themselves. He had built an empire with his own 2 hands, turning himself from an orphan no one would spare a glance for, into the most powerful kingpin in New York. He had money. He had power. He had the fear of the whole city. But he had never had anyone who needed him. Never had anyone waiting for him at home. Never had anyone ask, "Will you come back?" with eyes full of worry and hope. Not until tonight. The car slowed and turned onto the familiar road leading to the estate. The iron gate opened, and the Maybach rolled through, coming to a stop in front of the granite steps. Reed looked up. The lights in the living room were still on. Warm yellow light spilled through the tall windows, casting bright rectangles across the lawn. Through the clear glass, he saw the shapes of 2 children moving inside. They were still awake. They were waiting for him. Reed's heart beat faster, not from fear, a feeling he had forgotten long ago, not from tension, something he had grown so used to that he no longer noticed it, but from something else, something strange and warm, rising from somewhere deep inside his chest, something he didn't know what to call. He stepped out of the car, his shoes touching the stone path. He crossed the wide courtyard and climbed the familiar steps. Every step felt heavier than usual, not because he was tired, but because of the weight of what awaited him. The front door opened before he could reach for it. Knox stood there, his round face lighting up like a small sun, his brown eyes sparkling with open joy. "You're back!" he shouted, his clear voice ringing through the foyer. Then Knox ran toward Reed, his little feet tapping across the marble floor. But he stopped a few steps away, suddenly shy, not knowing what to do. He stood there, his hands clasped together against his chest, looking up at Reed with an expression full of happiness and uncertainty. Reed looked down at Knox. The tiny boy stood there before him, wide brown eyes, slightly tousled curls puffed up from play, looking at him with completely genuine happiness. No agenda, no calculation, just a child who was glad that someone he cared about had come home safely. They looked at each other for a long moment. The most powerful kingpin in New York and a 6-year-old boy, standing in the middle of the grand foyer, neither of them speaking. Then Knox stepped forward. He wrapped his arms around Reed's leg, those little arms circling his thigh and holding tight, as though afraid that if he let go, Reed would disappear. Reed froze. His body went rigid as stone. Those small arms were wrapped around his leg, Knox's head resting against his thigh, the warmth of that little body reaching him through the fabric of his trousers. How long had it been since anyone had hugged him? He couldn't remember. Maybe not since his mother was alive. Maybe longer even than that. Reed's hand lifted, hesitating in the air. He didn't know what to do. For 20 years, he had learned how to handle every situation, negotiate with enemies, give orders to subordinates, face death without blinking. But no one had ever taught him how to handle a child hugging his leg. Then slowly, as if his body were moving on instinct without waiting for his mind to command it, he placed his hand on Knox's head. Gently, carefully, as though afraid he might break something precious. He stroked the boy's slightly curly hair, feeling its softness beneath a palm hardened by fists and guns. Knox tipped his face up, grinning wide, dimples lighting his cheeks. "I'm so glad you're home. I was worried. I kept asking Miss Patty if you were back, and she kept saying wait, but I couldn't sleep." Reed swallowed hard, his throat tightening with a strange emotion. "I'm glad too," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "I'm glad to be home too." Miles stood at the living room doorway, watching everything with brown eyes older than his years. He didn't run over to hug him the way his brother didn't show his feelings in any impulsive way. But when his eyes met Reed's, he gave a small nod, a brief nod, the kind shared between men. That was Miles's way of saying, "I'm glad too," without opening his mouth. Willa stood behind Miles, leaning lightly against the living room doorframe. Her amber brown eyes shone with tears, but she wasn't crying. She was simply standing there, smiling, a smile full of gratitude, and something else Reed didn't dare give a name to. Reed bent down, lowering himself to Knox's level, and for the first time in his life, He hugged a child back. Knox gave a delighted squeal, throwing his arms around Reed's neck and laughing against his ear. The boy's warm breath touched his shoulder, his clear laughter ringing like wind chimes. And Reed realized that in all the victories he had ever claimed, all the money he had ever made, all the power he had ever held, nothing compared to this feeling. The feeling of being welcomed, the feeling of being needed, the feeling that someone was waiting for him to come home. It was late at night. The twins had gone to sleep after Patty took them back to their room, Knox dozing off right on the housekeeper's shoulder after trying to stay awake a little longer for Reed, while Miles had walked to his room on his own with his little sketchbook clutched against his chest, giving Reed a quiet nod before he disappeared down the hall. The mansion had sunk into silence, broken only by the ticking of a clock somewhere echoing through the long corridor and the sound of the night wind moving through the maple trees outside the windows. Reed sat in his study, the room where he had sat alone for thousands of nights before this one. The warm yellow glow of the desk lamp fell across the intricately carved oak bookshelves, across the mahogany desk where he had signed hundreds of multi-million-dollar agreements, across the expensive paintings hanging on the walls that he had never truly looked at. A glass of whiskey rested in his hand, the amber liquid glimmering beneath the light. But he hadn't taken a sip. He only sat there, staring into space, thinking about everything that had happened that day. A soft knock at the door broke the silence. 2 gentle knocks, polite and careful, as though the person standing outside didn't want to intrude but still needed to be noticed. Reed lifted his head. "Come in." The door opened. Willa stepped inside, still wearing the thin, cream-colored sweater she had had on all evening, a steaming cup of hot tea in her hands. She stood at the threshold for a second, as though deciding whether she ought to come any farther. "I thought you might need this more than the whiskey," she said, her voice as soft as leaves stirring outside the window. Reed looked at her, then down at the glass of whiskey in his hand. He set the drink on the desk and took the cup of tea from her. Warmth spread through his palm, and the light scent of chamomile and honey drifted upward. "Thank you." Willa nodded and turned as if to leave. She had done what she came to do, had brought tea to her employer the way a good housekeeper ought to. But before she could step back through the door, Reed's voice stopped her. "Stay." Willa hesitated, her feet pausing mid-step. She turned to look at him, amber brown eyes filled with uncertainty. But then she gave a small nod and walked over to the leather chair across from the desk and sat down. They remained in silence for a long while. Reed took a sip of tea, feeling the warmth slide down his throat. Willa sat with her back straight, her hands folded together in her lap, waiting. Reed set the cup down and spoke first. "You're not going to ask what happened?" Willa answered gently, her voice calm, as if they were speaking about the weather. "I know you won. If you hadn't, you wouldn't have come home." Reed looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. Smart, composed, no panic, no empty questions, no pretending to care just to earn favor. She said exactly what needed saying and stayed silent when silence was what mattered, not like any woman he had ever known in the underworld, where women were usually either too frightened to speak or too greedy to stay quiet. Vance was stripped of power, Reed said, deciding she deserved to know the truth. The council voted. He'll have to leave New York. He won't threaten you again. Willa let out a breath, and her shoulders seemed to drop a little. "And Brody?" Reed answered without emotion. "He told them everything in exchange for his life. His statement was the deciding evidence that brought Vance down. In return, he's allowed to live, but he has to leave the city. He can never come back, if he ever sets foot in New York again." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Willa understood. She nodded and didn't ask anything more. That chapter was closed now. Brody, the man she had once loved, once thought dead, once mourned, was now only a name from the past. She had deleted his number. She had already chosen. Silence settled between them again, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who didn't need to fill the space with meaningless words. Reed set his tea down on the desk and looked into Willa's eyes. "Today, in front of the council, I said that you and the boys were my family." Willa looked up, her amber brown eyes meeting his gray ones. "Patty told me," she said softly. "She said you protected us in front of all the other kingpins." Reed nodded, then said what he had been thinking all night. "That wasn't just something I said to defeat Vance. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't a trick." Willa stayed quiet, her eyes fixed on him, waiting. Reed looked out the window, where the darkness lay thick over the garden. His voice dropped lower. as if he were speaking words he had never spoken to anyone before. I've never had a family. Since I was 7, I've been alone. I've never known what it feels like to have someone waiting for me to come home. Never known what it feels like to have someone need me, not for money, not for power, just for me. Willa said nothing. She only listened. Reed went on, his eyes still on the window as if he couldn't bear to look at her while saying these things. Tonight, when the car stopped in front of the house, I saw the living room lights still on. I saw the 2 boys standing at the window waiting. Knox ran out and hugged me as if I were the most important person in the world to him. His voice wavered slightly, something that hadn't happened in 20 years, something he hadn't believed himself capable of anymore. And I realized I want that, not just today, every day. Every day to come home and have someone waiting. Every day to hear the boys laughing. Every day to feel as though I belong somewhere. Willa's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. She only sat there, listening as the most powerful man in New York confessed the loneliness he had hidden his whole life. Reed turned back to look at her, and his eyes weren't cold anymore. There was something warmer in them now, something more vulnerable. I'm not asking anything of you. I'm not forcing you. I just want you to know that if you choose to stay, you won't be a housekeeper. You and your boys will be part of this place. Part of my family. Willa whispered, her voice trembling slightly. I need time to think. This is a big decision. For me. For the boys. Reed nodded. I know. I'm not in a hurry. You can take all the time you need. Willa rose and walked toward the door, but before she stepped out, she stopped and turned back to look at him. Her amber-brown eyes met his gray ones in the warm yellow light. My boy's like you, especially Knox. He talks about you all the time before he falls asleep. Reed asked, his voice lower now. What about you? Willa smiled, a smile as light as a falling petal, her eyes glowing with something warm she had thought she would never be able to feel again after everything Brody had done. I'm learning how to trust again. She stepped out of the room, but she left the door slightly open behind her. A narrow line of light from the hallway spilled into the study, drawing a thin golden line across the wooden floor. Reed looked at that strip of light for a long time. The door was left ajar. Not closed, not thrown wide open, just slightly open, like a gentle invitation, like an opportunity offered without being forced. It was a small sign, but for Reed, a man who had lived in darkness for 20 years, it was all the light he needed. The next morning, sunlight poured through the windows of the Ashford mansion, sweeping away the darkness of the night before and laying a golden wash across the wide garden, rich and luminous as honey. The drops of night dew still clinging to the rose petals sparkled like tiny diamonds, and birdsong drifted from somewhere in the maple trees, announcing the start of a new day. Reed stepped outside, getting ready to leave for work as he did every morning. His charcoal gray suit was pressed to perfection. His dark blue tie knotted flawlessly, his polished black leather shoes catching the early light. The black Maybach was already running, its engine purring softly like a cat, and Reg stood by the car door waiting, just as he always did. But someone was waiting on the front steps. Miles stood there, still wearing blue-striped pajamas, his hair slightly mussed from sleep, the familiar sketchbook held against his chest. He looked at Reed with clear brown eyes and waited. Reed stopped and looked down at the boy. You're up already? It's still early. Miles shook his head, his voice quiet but clear. I wanted to give you this, before you go. He held out the sketchbook to Reed, the same notebook that had stayed with him since the day before, the same one filled with rough drawings that had saved the life of the most powerful kingpin in New York. Reed took the sketchbook and opened it. Inside was a new drawing, different from all the others. It showed 4 people standing together in front of the mansion, drawn in colored pencil. A tall man in a suit with dark hair stood on the right. A woman with long brown hair stood on the left, and between them stood 2 twin boys side by side, one in a red shirt and one in a blue one. All 4 of them were smiling. Beneath the drawing, in a child's uneven but unmistakable handwriting, was one word: family. Reed looked at the drawing for a long time. His fingers moved lightly over each line, over the faces of the 4 people in the picture, over the clumsy word written underneath. His throat tightened with an emotion he still wasn't used to naming. Miles spoke softly. I drew it last night, after you came home, after Knox fell asleep. Reed lifted his eyes and looked at the boy. Is this what you want? Miles nodded, his clear gaze unshaken. Knox wants it too. He told me before he fell asleep that he wants you to be our dad. The boy paused for a second, then added in a smaller voice, "And I think Mom wants it too. She just doesn't know how to say it yet." Reed bent down, lowering himself to Miles's eye level the way he had done the day before, when he promised he would come back. "Do you know something? You saved my life yesterday. If it hadn't been for you, I would have walked straight into that trap." Miles smiled, a small smile from a child who knew he had done the right thing. "I know. You weren't supposed to go back. I told you." Reed smiled, and for the first time it was a real smile, not cold, not calculating, not hidden behind the mask he had worn for 20 years. Just a smile, simple and genuine. "You did, and I listened." Behind them, the front door opened. Willa and Knox stepped out, with Knox still sleepy, rubbing his eyes. But the moment he saw Reed, he woke right up. Knox waved, his bright little voice ringing across the courtyard. "Be careful at work, and come home early. Miss Patty said she's making apple pie tonight, and you have to come eat it with us." Willa stood quietly beside her son, saying nothing, but her amber-brown eyes were resting on Reed with the same look he had seen the night before. The look of someone learning how to trust again. The look of someone opening her heart, little by little, the way she had left the door slightly open the night before. Reed rose to his feet, the sketchbook still in his hand. He gave Willa a slight nod, a small gesture that carried more than words ever could. Then he stepped into the car and settled into the familiar back seat. The Maybach rolled slowly away, its tires moving soundlessly across the stone drive toward the front gate. But this time Reed didn't look ahead the way he always had. He looked into the rearview mirror. 3 figures stood at the door, a woman and 2 children, waving, smiling, waiting for him to come back. For 20 years, Reed Ashford had always moved forward, never looking back, never stopping, never allowing himself the weakness of attachment or longing for anything. But today he understood that some things were worth returning to, some people were worth protecting, and there was one place, for the first time in his life, that he could call home. The sketchbook lay on the seat beside him, open to the final page. The drawing of 4 people standing together, the clumsy word family written beneath them. Reed Ashford, the most powerful kingpin in New York, the man the whole city feared, was smiling for the first time in his life at the thought of tomorrow. The story ends here, my friends. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the final moments of today's video. What did you think of this story? Were you moved as you witnessed Reed's journey from a cold and lonely kingpin into a man who learned how to love and be loved? Or were you most struck by the courage of little Miles, the boy who stood up to protect his whole family with nothing more than a rough little sketchbook? We'd truly love to hear what you felt in the deepest part of your heart, so please leave a comment below and share your thoughts with us. If you enjoyed this story, please press the like button to support us, and don't forget to share this video with your friends and loved ones, especially those who enjoy emotional and meaningful stories. And if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, please hit the subscribe button now and turn on notifications so you don't miss our new videos every day. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Always remember, just as Reed learned, family isn't the place where you're born, but the place where you choose to belong. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.